1/3. That's the number US. US intelligence can actually confirm with certainty, according to people who've actually seen the classified assessment behind closed doors. Not the entire stockpile, not evaporated overnight. 1/3. And by the end of this breakdown, you're going to understand exactly why that one number, buried inside a Reuters exclusive most people never saw, matters more than any dramatic headline claiming Iran's missiles simply vanished into thin air overnight. Let's get the framing right immediately, because this is a story where the exaggerated version and the real version are both genuinely dramatic, just in completely different ways, and only one of them is actually true. Iran's missile stockpile has not evaporated, but something close to the most sustained, most systematic campaign to degrade a single country's missile arsenal in modern military history has been running for months now, and the real numbers behind it are wild enough on their own without anyone needing to inflate them for views. Here's how this breakdown is sourced, because a claim this big demands real receipts, not vibes. Everything here comes from a Reuters exclusive citing 5 separate people familiar with U.S. intelligence assessments, the Foundation for Defense of Democracy's detailed damage analysis, CSIS's own munitions tracking report, JINSA's firepower assessment, the Critical Threats Project's daily intelligence updates, Israeli military statements delivered directly by IDF spokespeople and reporting from the New York Times and the Washington Post on a separate, disputed intelligence assessment. Where these sources disagree, and they disagree more than you'd expect on a topic this important, I'm going to walk you through exactly where the gap is and why it exists, instead of picking whichever number sounds more satisfying to repeat. So where did the evaporated stockpile narrative even come from in the first place? Let's trace it back carefully, because it certainly didn't come out of nowhere. Back on March 1st, Israeli military spokesman Brigadier General Efi Defrin said in a televised statement that Israeli operations had destroyed approximately half of Iran's missile stockpiles and prevented production of at least 1,500 additional missiles, adding that Iran had been producing dozens of surface-to-surface missiles per month, with plans to scale up toward hundreds monthly. Half the stockpile, 1,500 future missiles denied, that's a genuinely massive claim, and it's the kind of statement that, repeated and exaggerated across enough social media posts over enough months, easily curdles into something like Iran's entire arsenal evaporated by the time it reaches you. But notice what that claim actually says. Half, not all. And notice who's making it. One side's own military spokesperson describing the successes of that same side's own operation. That doesn't make it false. It does make it exactly the kind of claim that needs independent verification before you treat it as settled fact. Now here's where the real story gets genuinely interesting. Because when American intelligence tried to independently verify claims like that one, the answer they came back with internally was considerably more cautious and hedged than the confident public statements coming out of Israel. According to a Reuters exclusive citing 5 people familiar with U.S. intelligence assessments, as the war approached its 1-month mark, the United States could only determine with certainty that it had destroyed about 1/3 of Iran's vast missile arsenal. 1/3, not half, not the entire stockpile, not anywhere close to fully accounted for. The status of roughly another 1/3 was described as less clear, with sources saying bombings had likely damaged, destroyed, or buried those missiles in underground tunnels and bunkers, meaning probably gone but not confirmed gone. And that leaves a final 1/3 whose status the assessment didn't even attempt to characterize with any real confidence one way or the other. An entire 1/3 of a major regional power's missile arsenal simply marked unknown by the best intelligence apparatus in the world. Read that again, slowly. America's own intelligence community, working with satellite imagery, signals intelligence, and everything else in its considerable toolkit, could only put a certainty stamp on 1 out of every 3 missiles in Iran's entire arsenal, months into one of the most intense, sustained bombing campaigns in recent memory. Why is it so hard for anyone, even the world's best resourced intelligence agencies, to just count how many missiles are actually left? This is the part most coverage skips completely, and it's the actual key to understanding why this entire story is so contested in the first place. More contested than almost any other single number to come out of this entire war. Iran doesn't store its missiles the way you might picture a stockpile. Lined up in an open field somewhere, satellites can just count them from orbit. A huge portion of Iran's arsenal sits in underground tunnels and hardened bunkers specifically designed and engineered over years of investment to survive exactly the kind of bombing campaign this war has thrown at them. When a bomb hits the entrance to one of those tunnel complexes, you can confirm the entrance was destroyed. What you often can't confirm from the outside, no matter how good your satellite imagery is whether the missiles stored deep inside actually got destroyed too, or whether they're sitting completely intact behind tons of collapsed rock and concrete, buried but recoverable, once Iran has time and equipment to dig them back out and clear the access routes. That single fact, that destruction and burial look nearly identical from a satellite photo taken from hundreds of miles up, is exactly why American intelligence drew such a careful distinction between confirmed destroyed and likely damaged, destroyed, or buried, because those are genuinely different outcomes with completely different implications for how many missiles Iran might still be able to access down the road, months or even years after this specific war eventually winds down. And just when you think the picture couldn't get murkier, it did, in a way that made this story briefly a genuine controversy inside Washington itself. On May 12th, the New York Times reported, citing unnamed U, Hess officials with access to a classified intelligence assessment that Iran had retained roughly 70% of its pre-war missile stockpile. 70%. Let that sink in against the earlier claims of half-destroyed or worse coming out of Israeli statements just weeks earlier. The Washington Post published similar claims around the same period, also citing U.S. intelligence officials speaking on condition of anonymity. This is where it gets genuinely newsworthy in a way most coverage of this war completely missed. Those reports drew unusually direct public pushback from U.S. officials themselves, with the CENTCOM commander addressing the discrepancy directly in testimony before the Senate Armed Services Committee on May 14th, just 2 days after the Times story ran. When your own intelligence community is publicly disputing leaked assessments from inside that same community in sworn testimony to Congress, that's not a minor technical disagreement buried in a footnote somewhere. That's a visible public sign of just how genuinely difficult and contested this specific piece of battlefield assessment has been throughout this entire war, at every level from field intelligence up to Senate hearing rooms. Let's bring in one more serious, independent analysis to help make sense of all this conflicting information, because relying on any single source here, American, Israeli, or Iranian, would be a genuine mistake, given how much each of them has riding on which number ends up being believed. The Foundation for Defense of Democracies published a detailed damage analysis concluding that Iran likely lost roughly a third to half of its ballistic missile arsenal and approximately half of its missile launchers. That's a real defensible middle ground between the more conservative one-third confirmed figure from Reuters intelligence sources and the more aggressive half or more claims coming out of Israeli statements. And it comes from analysts specifically working to reconcile the gap between these competing narratives using open source methods rather than simply picking a side and running with it. Here's a detail that actually clarifies a lot of the confusion running through this entire story. And it's the kind of nuance a headline like Iran's entire stockpile evaporated completely erases in favor of a cleaner, more dramatic claim. Missiles and launchers are not the same thing, and confidence in destroying one is very different from confidence in destroying the other. Launchers are the actual vehicles and platforms that fire the missiles, and they're considerably harder to hide than the missiles themselves sitting in storage. They need to physically move to launch positions. They generate heat and electronic signatures that surveillance systems are specifically built to detect, and they're frequently caught out in the open during the actual act of firing, which is inherently the most vulnerable moment in the entire process. That makes launchers a fundamentally easier target to confirm destroyed than a missile sitting motionless deep inside a mountain bunker where no sensor can directly observe it. Multiple sources converge on launcher losses being severe, with assessments describing roughly half of Iran's launcher fleet destroyed, and some reporting during the most intense stretches of fighting, describing launcher losses exceeding 60% of the pre-war fleet. That distinction matters enormously in practice, because even if Iran genuinely retained a large percentage of its physical missile inventory, exactly as that disputed 70% retained assessment suggested, a missile without a functioning launcher and without the logistics network to move it from an underground bunker to an actual launch position is, for practical military purposes, on any given day of this war, a missile that can't actually be fired anytime soon, regardless of how intact it technically remains. Iran's own battlefield behavior throughout this war seems to reflect exactly that constraint in practice. Multiple intelligence assessments describe Iran shifting deliberately towards smaller, irregular missile salvos, rather than the large, overwhelming barrages it fired in the opening days of the conflict. A pattern analysts have directly linked to shrinking launcher capacity and degraded logistics, rather than a genuine shortage of missiles sitting somewhere in storage waiting to be used. There's one more data point worth examining closely, precisely because it's the most dramatic one out there, and dramatic claims deserve the most scrutiny, not the least, especially on a channel that's built its entire approach around exactly that principle. During one particularly intense 10-day stretch of this war, reporting citing IDF estimates claimed Iran's missile fire rate had collapsed by 92%, with more than 60% of launchers destroyed, and Iran retaining somewhere between just 100 and 200 active launchers out of what had been a much larger force at the war's outset. That same reporting made even more extraordinary claims alongside it, describing Iran's navy as entirely eliminated, 43 vessels destroyed or damaged, including one ship reportedly torpedoed by an American submarine off the coast of Sri Lanka, thousands of miles from Iran itself, and another disabled with over 200 sailors transferred off before it eventually went down. I want to flag something important about a report like this one because it's exactly the kind of claim that deserves the careful treatment I've been giving every other number in this breakdown. The sheer volume and severity of claims packed into one single account, an entire navy eliminated, a submarine torpedo strike thousands of miles from Iran's coast, over 90% fire rate collapse, all attributed to unnamed IDF estimates within a single 10-day window, is exactly the kind of report that needs corroboration from additional independent sources before being treated as a fully verified account rather than one side's own battlefield assessment during the most intense, chaotic phase of active fighting, when accurate real-time information is hardest to come by for everyone involved. Some elements of it, the general direction of collapsing fire rates and shrinking launcher numbers, do align reasonably well with the more conservative figures from Reuters and FDD's independent analysis, which lends it some credibility. Other elements, particularly the specific claim of Iran's entire navy being eliminated in just 10 days, go considerably further than anything I've been able to independently corroborate through other sourcing available to me. And that gap between the plausible parts and the more extraordinary parts is exactly why I'm walking you through this specific source with this level of caution, rather than simply repeating the most dramatic number in the report, as if it were settled, uncontested fact. Let's go deeper into the actual mechanics of how a missile gets from storage to launch, because understanding that process clarifies why launcher destruction ends up mattering just as much, arguably more, than raw missile counts when you're trying to assess how much real fighting capability a country actually retains at any given moment. A ballistic missile sitting quietly in an underground bunker isn't a threat to anyone by itself. It has to be extracted from storage, transported often over considerable distance across territory that may itself be under surveillance, to a prepared or improvised launch site, mated with its launch platform, fueled if it's a liquid-fueled system, which takes additional time and creates additional vulnerability, and then actually fired, all while potentially under observation from the kind of persistent aerial and satellite surveillance that's been a hallmark of this entire war from its opening days onward. Every single step in that chain is a distinct point of vulnerability, and every strike that destroys a transporter erector launcher, disrupts a known extraction route, or destroys a fueling facility degrades Iran's actual usable firepower without needing to touch a single missile sitting safely in storage deep underground. That's precisely why the launcher destruction numbers across multiple sources, roughly half according to more conservative estimates, more than 60% according to the most aggressive claims, tell a more operationally meaningful story than the contested missile stockpile percentage alone ever could on its own. You could have Iran's optimistic 70% retained scenario from that leaked assessment be technically accurate in terms of raw missile counts sitting in bunkers, and it would still mean relatively little for Iran's actual near-term ability to launch large, coordinated attacks if the launchers, logistics, and extraction infrastructure needed to actually use those missiles have themselves been degraded by half or more over the same period. There's a production angle here, too, that deserves real attention, because destroying existing stockpiles is only half the equation in a war that's dragged on for months rather than days. Israel's early claim about preventing 1,500 additional missiles from being produced points to a parallel campaign that's run alongside stockpile strikes the entire time, hitting the actual factories and production infrastructure that let Iran replace what it loses. If that campaign has been even partially successful, and multiple sources describe the U.S., military specifically publishing imagery of strikes on weapons-producing factories, stressing that the campaign wasn't just pursuing existing stockpiles, but the industrial base that makes them, then the real story isn't just how many missiles Iran has left today, it's how much capacity Iran retains to replace whatever it's already fired or lost going forward. A country that starts a war with 2,500 missiles and burns through a third of them while simultaneously losing half its production capacity ends up in a fundamentally worse long-term position than raw stockpile numbers alone would suggest. Let's talk about the actual scale of what's been fired, because this is where you get a real visceral sense of how much sustained pressure this arsenal has actually been under, separate from the destruction question entirely. Iran entered this war with an estimated stockpile somewhere around 2,500 ballistic missiles, according to Israeli military assessments, alongside a separate, much larger short-range arsenal that Jinsa's analysis put at somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 missiles at the outset of fighting. In just the first 4 days of fighting, Iran fired more than 500 ballistic missiles and roughly 2,000 drones, an extraordinary rate of expenditure by almost any historical standard for a conflict this short. But that pace didn't hold. Launch rates dropped by roughly 90% for drones and 83% for ballistic missiles within about a week, according to CSIS's own munitions tracking, a collapse in fire rate that lines up closely with the launcher destruction numbers from other sources, reinforcing that whatever's actually constraining Iran's ability to keep fighting at scale, it's showing up consistently across multiple independent measurements of how this war has actually been fought, not just in one contested stockpile estimate. Let's bring CENTCOM's own numbers into this picture too, because they add another layer to the story that most coverage of this topic leaves out entirely. According to the same Reuters reporting, U.S. strikes had hit more than 10,000 Iranian military targets as of the point that report was published, and Central Command specifically stated it had sunk 92% of the Iranian Navy's large vessels, a figure that, notably, comes with an actual specific percentage and a specific category, large vessels, attached to it, rather than the more sweeping entire Navy eliminated framing from that other, less corroborated report we walked through earlier. That distinction matters, and it's exactly the kind of precision that tends to separate a credible official statement from an exaggerated second-hand claim. CENTCOM has published imagery specifically documenting strikes on the factories that produce Iran's weaponry, and has stressed publicly, repeatedly, that its campaign was never just about hitting existing missile and drone stockpiles. It was about targeting the entire industrial base that manufactures replacements, precisely the production infrastructure. Israel's earlier claim about preventing 1,500 additional missiles was also describing from its own side of the operation. And yet, even with more than 10,000 targets struck and that level of sustained, relentless pressure applied over months, Central Command has specifically declined to state precisely how much of Iran's missile or drone capability has actually been destroyed in total. Read that carefully, because it's genuinely significant. The organization running the most extensive strike campaign in this entire war, with access to the best intelligence and reconnaissance available to any single actor involved anywhere in this conflict, chose not to put a specific number on total missile destruction, even after 10,000 strikes across months of continuous operations. If the answer were simple enough to state as one clean, satisfying percentage, that's exactly the kind of number a military would normally want to publicize loudly to demonstrate the success of its campaign. The fact that CENTCOM didn't do that tells you the actual internal assessment is genuinely uncertain, not just publicly downplayed for some strategic communications reason. One source close to this assessment process pointed to a specific reason for that uncertainty that's worth understanding directly, because it cuts to the heart of why this entire debate exists in the first place. Part of the problem in determining how much of Iran's arsenal has actually been destroyed comes down to something surprisingly basic. Nobody outside Iran's own military ever had a fully confirmed count of how many missiles were stockpiled in underground bunkers before this war even started. You simply cannot precisely calculate a percentage destroyed when your starting baseline itself is an estimate rather than a confirmed figure agreed upon by all sides. Israeli military officials have stated Iran had 2,500 ballistic missiles capable of reaching Israel specifically before the war began, but that's Israel's own pre-war estimate of one specific missile category, capable of reaching Israeli territory, not necessarily Iran's complete arsenal across every missile type and range in its inventory, including the much larger short-range stockpile JINSA's analysis separately estimated at somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 missiles total. When your starting number is itself an estimate, and your ending number depends entirely on interpreting satellite imagery of collapsed tunnel entrances that could mean anything from total destruction to complete preservation underneath the rubble, you end up with exactly the kind of wide, genuinely contested range we've walked through in this breakdown. Not because anyone involved is necessarily lying to you, but because the fundamental information needed to produce one single precise answer simply doesn't exist yet in a form anyone outside Iran's own military leadership can fully verify from the outside. It's worth putting this entire campaign in some historical context too, because sustained efforts to degrade an adversary's missile arsenal through airstrikes are not new to modern warfare, but the scale and duration of this specific campaign against Iran stands out even against that broader history of similar attempts elsewhere. Attempts to hunt and destroy mobile missile launchers have historically proven extremely difficult, going back decades to Cold War-era exercises and later conflicts, where mobile ballistic missile forces demonstrated a stubborn, well-documented ability to survive sustained bombing campaigns specifically because of their mobility and their ability to disperse and hide between launches, frustrating even the most sophisticated targeting efforts available at the time. What makes this campaign against Iran notable by comparison is the sheer duration and intensity applied, 10,000 plus targets struck, months of sustained operations, and a specific, deliberate strategy of targeting not just launchers and stockpiles, but the production infrastructure itself, an approach that, if genuinely effective at scale, represents a more comprehensive attempt to permanently degrade a missile force than most historical precedents have achieved anywhere. Whether it actually succeeds at that broader goal, permanently and substantially reducing Iran's long-term missile capability rather than just temporarily suppressing it during active hostilities, is a question that won't be fully answerable until well after this war eventually ends, and analysts get real time to assess the full picture with far better information than what's available in real time during active combat. Let's also talk about what Iran's own government has said publicly about its remaining capability, because that's a piece of this story worth including, even though, like every other source in this breakdown, it comes with its own obvious incentives attached. Iranian officials have, at various points throughout this war, made public statements asserting their missile and defense capabilities remain fully intact and capable of continued operations. Statements that serve an obvious deterrent and morale purpose regardless of their underlying accuracy. Iran has continued launching missile attacks throughout this war, including strikes on Gulf states, on American positions, and the ballistic missile attack on Jordan that killed American service members earlier this month, which does demonstrate some ongoing capability to launch missiles well after months of sustained strikes against its arsenal. But continuing to launch missiles, even in reduced numbers and smaller salvos, isn't the same as having anything close to a fully intact pre-war arsenal, and Iran's own shift towards smaller, more irregular attacks rather than the large-scale barrages it fired in the war's opening days is itself a kind of evidence, observable through its actual battlefield behavior, rather than through any single government's claims that something real has changed in its available capacity since this war began. It's worth pointing out, because fairness matters here just as much as accuracy, that Iran isn't the only side burning through irreplaceable munitions in this specific war. CSIS's own analysis is explicit that the United States has significantly depleted its own missile inventories throughout this conflict, though it concludes America still retains enough to continue fighting under any plausible near-term scenario without an immediate crisis. The real risk CSIS flags isn't actually this specific war at all. It's what depleted American stockpiles would mean for a future, much larger conflict against a genuine peer competitor. A concern that ties directly into the same kind of supply chain and production bottleneck problems we've covered before on this channel, with America's own bunker buster inventory running short with no meaningful resupply expected for years. Wars like this one don't just deplete the losing side's capability the way headlines tend to frame it. They burn through everyone's expensive, hard-to-replace stockpiles simultaneously, on both sides of the fight. And that's a detail that gets lost every single time coverage focuses exclusively on how badly the other side is supposedly losing, without asking the same hard questions about the winning side's own inventory. So what does all of this actually add up to? Let me give you my honest synthesis of a genuinely messy, contested picture. Because after walking through this many competing numbers from this many different sources, you deserve a clear bottom line, rather than just being left with a pile of conflicting statistics to sort through on your own. The most careful, most independently sourced assessment available, the one US. Intelligence was willing to stand behind with actual certainty rather than hedged language, put confirmed missile destruction at about a third of Iran's arsenal, with another third probably gone but unconfirmed, and a final third whose status simply wasn't characterized with confidence at all by anyone involved in that assessment. Independent analysis from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies lands in a similar range, a third to half of the missile arsenal, roughly half the launchers. Israeli claims pushed considerably higher, and a leaked American intelligence assessment reported by The Times and The Post pushed the other direction entirely, suggesting Iran retained the large majority of what it started with, an assessment senior officials directly disputed in open Senate testimony. Somewhere in that spread sits the actual truth, and based on the weight of independent, cross-referenced evidence, particularly the consistent collapse in Iran's actual fire rate across multiple separate sources, and Iran's own observable shift towards smaller, less coordinated attacks, the most defensible read is that Iran has lost a meaningful, serious fraction of its missile capability, likely somewhere between a third and half of its stockpile, an even larger share of its ability to actually launch what remains, and a real, if incomplete, dent in its capacity to rebuild what it's lost through domestic production. That is a massive, historically significant degradation of a major regional missile power's arsenal, achieved through one of the most sustained and comprehensive targeting campaigns against a single country's missile force in recent memory, arguably rivaling or exceeding anything comparable from prior conflicts, specifically because of how it combined stockpile strikes, launcher hunting, and production disruption into one continuous, coordinated effort, rather than treating those as three separate problems. It is not evaporation. It is not zero. Iran can still, demonstrably, launch missiles. It did so against Jordan just this month with lethal effect, killing American service members and proving that whatever capability remains is still genuinely dangerous regardless of how diminished it may be compared to where this war started. And pretending the stockpile simply vanished doesn't make the real story less impressive. It just makes it less true. and less true is exactly the kind of thing that gets a channel's credibility questioned the moment someone actually checks the sourcing behind a claim like that, which, given how contested and heavily reported this specific topic has been, plenty of people watching this video are more than capable of doing themselves with a quick search. What I'd watch for next is whether any side, American, Israeli, or Iranian, produces harder, more independently verifiable evidence than what's publicly available right now, actual on-the-ground assessment of those buried tunnel complexes, rather than satellite photos of collapsed entrances that could mean almost anything, or a clearer public accounting of how much of Iran's production capacity has actually been restored since the strikes on its missile factories began months ago now. Until that happens, every number you see thrown around in this war, from every side involved, deserves the same treatment I've given every single claim in this breakdown: a specific named source, a specific level of confidence attached to it, and an honest acknowledgement of exactly how much remains genuinely unknown even to the intelligence agencies with the best access and the most resources dedicated to figuring it out correctly. Two things before you go, because on a story this contested, they matter more than usual. If breakdowns like this, the kind that trace a dramatic claim back to its actual source, separate confirmed intelligence from leaked assessments from one side's own battlefield claims, and land on the messy, honest middle ground instead of whichever number sounds best in a title, are useful to you, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because this exact kind of contested number story is going to keep coming up as this war grinds on for however many more months it takes to reach some kind of resolution. And I want you getting the carefully sourced version first, not whatever number happens to be trending on social media that particular week, regardless of whether it's actually accurate. And leave a comment telling me what you want tracked next, whether Iran's missile production capacity shows real signs of recovering in the weeks ahead despite the strikes on its factories, a deeper look at how launcher destruction specifically has reshaped Iran's actual battlefield tactics and attack patterns over the course of this war, or a closer comparison of how America's own munition stockpiles are holding up under the exact same kind of sustained wartime strain that's been grinding down Iran's arsenal. Those comments genuinely shape what gets covered here next. And on a topic with this many moving pieces and this much genuine uncertainty, that direct input helps more than usual. Thanks for watching, and stay skeptical of any number in this war that sounds too clean, too total, or too convenient to be entirely true. Because the real story, almost every single time you actually dig into the sourcing behind it rather than just accepting the headline at face value, sits somewhere messier and more genuinely uncertain in the middle, and that messiness, frustrating as it can be if you just want a simple answer, is usually a reliable sign you're looking at honest, careful reporting, rather than a headline engineered purely to grab your attention for the next 30 seconds before you scroll to something else entirely.